The war took his voice. 8 years later, a horse brought it back. But why she knew his name? No one was prepared for that. The silence started in a rice paddy near Saigon. It ended 8 years later when a horse named Bell called his name. But first, you need to understand what war can steal from a man. Not just his hearing or his legs or his sleep. Sometimes war steals his voice, takes every word he ever knew and buries them so deep that even he forgets they exist. That's what happened to Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison. The man who once commanded 30 soldiers couldn't order coffee at the diner. What you're about to discover will change how you think about healing, about memory, about the strange ways God works through His creatures to reach the unreachable parts of our souls. But first, let me tell you about the morning everything changed. Jake Morrison had been mucking stalls at Riverside Ranch for 3 months when Belle arrived. Nobody told him her name, nobody told him anything, really. The other hands had learned not to bother with conversation. Jake nodded when spoken to, pointed when asked questions, did his work with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd rather disappear than explain himself. The ranch owner, Tom Henley, hired him because Tom recognized something in Jake's eyes. 25 years running cattle and horses, Tom had seen that look before. The look of a man carrying weight that couldn't be set down. You show up, you work hard. That's all I need, Tom had said during their brief interview. He didn't ask about the tremor in Jake's hands or why a man in his 30s moved like he was made of glass. He didn't ask why Jake never spoke. For 3 months, Jake arrived at dawn, fed the horses, cleaned the stalls, repaired fence, left at sunset. The perfect employee who existed in a bubble of absolute silence. Then Belle came home. She was a 15-year-old Appaloosa mare, with white spots scattered across her brown coat like stars. Beautiful, but broken. A leg injury had ended her riding days, and she'd been retired to live out her remaining years in peaceful pasture. Tom led her from the trailer to the paddock, talking softly about her new home. Jake was replacing a broken fence post 50 yards away, his back turned to the scene. That's when it happened. Belle's head snapped up, her ears pricked forward, and she whinnied, not the general greeting horses give to new places, but something specific, something urgent, something that sounded almost like recognition. Jake's hammer froze mid-swing. Belle whinnied again, louder this time, insistent. Jake turned around slowly, and every hand on the ranch stopped what they were doing, because Jake Morrison, the man who hadn't spoken a word in 8 years, was staring at that horse, with tears streaming down his face. Belle, he whispered. The word came out cracked and rusty, like a door that hadn't been opened in decades. But it was her name, and somehow, impossibly, she knew he'd said it. Tom Henley would later swear he felt the earth shift under his boots in that moment. Not literally, but something changed. Something that had been broken for a very long time suddenly wasn't. But he didn't know the whole story yet. He didn't know that 8 years earlier, in a place where the air tasted like smoke and fear, a young soldier named Jake Morrison had whispered that same name to a cavalry horse as mortar shells fell around them. He didn't know that Belle had carried Jake and 3 wounded men to safety through 2 miles of enemy territory. He didn't know that she'd been the last living thing Jake spoke to before the explosion that killed his best friend and stole his voice. He didn't know that Jake had spent 8 years believing Belle died in that same explosion, and he couldn't possibly know that Belle had spent those same 8 years at a military facility in Virginia, recovering from her own wounds, waiting for the day she might see her boy again, the day she might hear him say her name. Some reunions happened by accident. This one happened by grace. But what happened next would change not just Jake Morrison's life, it would change how an entire town understood the true meaning of coming home. The silence at Riverside Ranch stretched like a held breath. Jake stood frozen by the fence post, hammer forgotten in his trembling hand. Belle pressed against the paddock rail, her brown eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that made Tom Henley's chest tighten. 8 years of questions suddenly demanded answers. You know this horse? Tom said quietly. It wasn't a question. Jake nodded once. His lips moved soundlessly, forming words that wouldn't come. That's when everything changed. Tom had seen war's aftermath before. His own father came back from Korea different, quieter, jumpier, prone to staring at nothing for hours, but he'd never seen healing happen in real time. Never watched a man's soul climb back from whatever dark place it had been hiding. Belle whinnied. Again, softer this time. Patient and Jake Morrison took his first real breath in 8 years. "Belle," he said again, stronger now. "My God, Belle." Word spread through Millbrook faster than gossip at a church social. The mute ranch hand could talk, but only to the horse. Dr. Patricia Reeves, the town's only psychiatrist, arrived at Riverside Ranch 3 days later. She'd been treating veterans since the first boys came home from Vietnam, and Tom Henley's phone call had kept her awake for 2 nights straight. Selective mutism following severe trauma, she explained to Tom as they watched Jake brush Belle. "In the morning sun, I've read about cases like this. The mind creates barriers to protect itself. Sometimes those barriers stay up for decades, and sometimes something happens. A trigger that breaks the dam." Jake was whispering to Belle as he worked, too quiet for them to hear the words, but his lips moved constantly now. 8 years of silence spilling out in a gentle stream directed at the only living thing he trusted to listen. Dr. Reeves took notes, made appointments, offered treatment. Jake ignored her completely. He spoke only to Belle. 3 weeks after Belle's arrival, Jake's sister Sarah drove down from Nashville. She hadn't seen her brother in 2 years, hadn't heard his voice in 8. Tom met her at the ranch gate, warning her what to expect. But nothing could have prepared Sarah Morrison Walsh for the sight of her baby brother, the same Jake who used to read her bedtime stories, curled up in Belle's stall at midnight, whispering secrets to a horse's patient ears. "Jake," she called softly. He looked up. For a moment, recognition flickered in his eyes. Then he looked away. Belle nickered softly, and Jake resumed his whispered conversation, shutting out the world that had failed him so completely. Sarah cried in her car for an hour, but she didn't leave. Something told her the story wasn't over yet. Tom Henley was a patient man, but mysteries ate at him like acid. He started making phone calls. The Army was surprisingly helpful once Tom explained the situation. Jake's service record painted the picture of a model soldier, 3 tours, multiple commendations, promoted to staff sergeant, by age to for. Then the incident report from his final mission. Tom read it twice, then poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey and read it again. Patrol ambushed 080 hours. Casualties heavy. SSG Morrison organized evacuation under fire. Used military horse to transport wounded. Horse and rider made 3 trips through hostile territory. Final trip. Explosion destroyed transport vehicle. Morrison found unconscious. Treated for traumatic brain injury. Severe PTSD. Horse declared Kier. Killed in action. Belle was supposed to be dead. Tom called the Army Veterinary Unit. "Oh, that mare," the officer said. "Hell of a story. Thought she was gone for sure. Shrapnel wounds. Broken ribs, internal bleeding. But she pulled through, spent 2 years in rehabilitation. Where is she now? Retired to civilian contractor. Some horse rescue outfit in, hold on, Virginia. Lady named Patricia Thornton." Tom's blood went cold. Patricia Thornton. He knew that name. She was Tom's ex-wife, the woman he'd divorced 15 years ago when she moved to Virginia to run a horse rescue. The woman who'd called him 3 weeks ago, asking if he knew anyone who might have space for a special needs mare. Some coincidences are too perfect to be accidents. This felt like something bigger. Something that required faith to understand. Jake was healing. But healing isn't linear. Some days he managed full sentences with Belle. Other days, the nightmares came back and he retreated into silence so complete that even the mare couldn't reach him. Dr. Reeves visited weekly now, documenting his progress with academic enthusiasm. "This is unprecedented," she told Tom. "The therapeutic bond between human and animal. I'm writing a paper." Tom wanted to tell her that some things weren't meant for papers. Some things were just meant to heal. Sarah visited every weekend, bringing pictures of Jake's nephews, boys he'd never met, because he couldn't face their innocent questions about Uncle Jake's war. She talked to Belle when Jake wouldn't talk to her. "Take care of him," she whispered into the mare's gray muzzle. "He's all I have left." Belle seemed to understand. The town started paying attention. Veterans from 3 counties began showing up at Riverside Ranch. Word had spread through the informal network that connects all warriors. The quiet understanding that passes between men who've seen too much. They came to see the man who'd found his voice. They stayed to watch him work with Belle. Some of them started talking to Tom about getting horses of their own. "There's something here," said Marcus Webb, a Gulf War vet who'd been fighting his own demons for 20 years. "Something that works." Tom began to see a larger picture forming. Something that might help more than just Jake Morrison. But first, Jake had to fully come back, and that would require facing the parts of his story he'd never told anyone, not even Belle. It happened on a Tuesday morning in October. Jake was leading Belle to pasture when a truck backfired on Highway 49. The sound cracked across the ranch like a rifle shot. Jake hit the ground instantly, pulling Belle down with him. His eyes went blank, not vacant, but filled with something else entirely. Something that belonged to a jungle on the other side of the world. "Incoming," he shouted. "Get down, get down." For 30 seconds, Jake Morrison was 24 years old again, holding a dying friend in a rice paddy while mortars fell like rain. Belle stayed pressed against the ground beside him, as still as stone. Waiting. When Jake's vision cleared, he found Dr. Reeves kneeling beside him. Sarah was there too. She'd started spending weekdays at the ranch, unable to bear the thought of Jake facing his demons alone. "Jake," Dr. Reeves said gently, "you're safe. You're in Tennessee. It's 1983. Jake looked around slowly. The ranch, the pasture, Belle's worried brown eyes inches from his face. "I lost her," he whispered. "I lost her in the jungle, and I never said goodbye." That's when Dr. Reeves understood. Jake wasn't just healing from war trauma. He was healing from grief. The deepest kind of grief, the kind that comes from losing someone you never got to thank. "Tell me about that day," Dr. Reeves said. They were sitting in Belle's stall, Jake on a hay bale, Belle's head resting on his shoulder, Sarah cross-legged in the straw, holding her breath. For the longest time, Jake said nothing. Then, slowly, the story came out. Charlie Company was pinned down near Fire Base Alpha. 30 men trapped in a clearing with wounded too heavy to carry. The choppers couldn't get in, too much ground fire. His voice was steady now, clinical, the voice of a soldier giving a report. Command said to hold position and wait for air support. But Jenkins was bleeding out. Morrison too, different Morrison, Tommy Morrison from Alabama, good kid, 19 years old. Belle shifted slightly, pressing closer. That's when I saw her. This cavalry horse, probably escaped from some old French plantation. Beautiful Appaloosa mare, looked like she'd been living wild. For months, Sarah realized she was crying. I called her Belle because, hell, I don't know why. She just looked like a Belle, proud, strong, like she knew something the rest of us had forgotten. Jake's hand found Belle's muzzle. Took me an hour to get close enough to touch her. Another hour to get a makeshift saddle on her back. But she let me, like she understood what we needed. The hardest part was coming. Jake's voice began to shake. 3 trips, that's how many it took to get all the wounded out. Belle carried them like they were made of glass. Never stumbled, never hesitated, even with bullets flying over our heads. He stopped talking. What happened on the 4th trip? Dr. Reeves asked softly. Jake closed his eyes. Tommy Morrison died while we were loading him, 19 years old. And the last thing he said was, "Tell my mama I was brave." I was holding him when the mortar hit. The explosion lived in Jake's body like a second heartbeat. When I woke up, I was in a field hospital. Took them 3 days to tell me Belle was gone. They said the blast killed her instantly. Said it was a miracle I survived. His voice broke. Completely. I never got to say goodbye, never got to tell her. She saved us all. Saved 30 American boys who got to go home because one horse was braver than all of us put together. Belle whinnied softly and Jake's eyes flew open. She was looking directly at him with an expression that seemed to say, "I'm here now." That afternoon, Tom Henley made a decision that would change everything. He called Patricia. His ex-wife answered on the second ring, as if she'd been expecting the call. "She remembers him, doesn't she?" Tom said without preamble. Patricia's laugh was soft and sad. I wondered when you'd figure it out. Yes, Tom, she remembers. Horses don't forget the people who saved their lives. Tell me, they found her 3 days after the explosion. Shrapnel wounds, but alive. The Army veterinarian said it was impossible. Nothing should have survived that blast. But Belle did. Tom gripped the phone tighter. She spent 2 years in Army rehabilitation. They were going to put her down twice. The injuries were that severe. But every time they scheduled it, she'd show some new sign of improvement. Like she was fighting to stay alive for a reason. For Jake, that's what I believe, when they finally retired her to my rescue. I knew she was waiting for something, someone. She'd get agitated whenever military vehicles passed the property. Would run to the fence line like she was looking for. Well, for him. Tom looked out the window. Jake was walking Belle around the paddock, both of them moving with the easy rhythm of old companions. "How did you know to call me?" he asked. "I didn't, not consciously. But 3 weeks ago, Belle started acting different, restless, like she could sense something coming. I just followed my instincts. Sometimes healing requires more than medicine. Sometimes it requires a miracle disguised as coincidence. Sometimes it requires a horse who remembers love." That evening, Jake Morrison did something he hadn't done in 8 years. He walked into Tom's office and asked to use the phone. "I need to call Tommy Morrison's mother," he said, "in Alabama. I have something to tell her." The conversation lasted 20 minutes. When Jake hung up, he was crying openly for the first time since the war. She said, "Tommy wrote about me in his letters, about the horse who was saving everyone. She wanted to thank me." Jake looked at Sarah, then at Tom, then at Dr. Reeves. "I think it's time to start talking to people again." Within 6 months, Riverside Ranch had become something nobody planned, but everyone needed. A place where broken soldiers came to find their voices. Jake Morrison, the man who'd been silent for 8 years, became their guide, not through words, though he used those now too, but through example, through the quiet demonstration that healing was possible, that connection could be rebuilt, that even the deepest wounds could learn to speak. Belle became the ranch's unofficial therapist. She seemed to recognize trauma in the men who visited, would approach the most wounded ones first, offering the same patient presence she'd given Jake. Dr. Reeves documented everything, but she'd stopped talking about papers. This was bigger than academic research. This was grace in action. Sarah Morrison Walsh brought her boys to meet their Uncle Jake on Thanksgiving Day, 1983. 8-year-old Michael and 6-year-old David had heard stories about their war hero uncle, but they'd never heard his voice. Jake knelt in Belle's stall and introduced himself properly. "I'm your Uncle Jake," he said, his voice steady and warm. "And this is Belle. She's the bravest horse in the world." The boys peppered him with questions about the war, about horses, about why he'd been so quiet for so long. Jake answered every one honestly. "Sometimes when people get hurt really badly, they need time to remember how to trust the world again," he explained. "Belle helped me remember." Michael, serious beyond his years, studied his uncle's face. "Are you okay now?" Jake considered the question carefully. "I'm better," he said finally. "And getting better every day." It was the most honest answer he could give. By Christmas, Riverside Ranch was hosting 23 veterans regularly. Some came daily, others weekly. A few drove down from as far as Kentucky and Georgia, seeking something they couldn't name, but recognized when they found it. Tom hired 2 more staff members, both Vietnam vets who'd found their own path back from darkness. The program had no official name, no government funding, no therapeutic protocol beyond the simple understanding that healing happens when wounded souls recognize they're not alone. Belle grew older gracefully, accepting the attention of dozens of men who saw something of themselves in her scars. Jake began speaking at VFW halls across Tennessee, not about the ranch exactly, about the importance of patience, of second chances, of believing that healing is always possible, even when it seems impossible. "Some wounds take 8 years to heal," he would say. "Some take longer. The timeline doesn't matter. What matters is refusing to give up on each other." His voice carried weight now, the authority of a man who'd been to the bottom, and found his way back. On the 8th anniversary of Jake finding his voice, Sarah brought a newspaper clipping to Riverside Ranch. It was a small item from the Nashville paper. Local horse therapy program receives state recognition. The informal veteran support program at Riverside Ranch in Millbrook has been credited with helping over 100 veterans reintegrate into civilian life. The program, which pairs veterans with rescue horses, was started by Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison Rhett and ranch owner Tom Henley. Jake read it twice, then folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. "Mom would have been proud," Sarah said. Softly, Jake nodded. Their mother had died while he was still silent, unable to tell her he loved her one last time. But Belle nickered softly from her stall, and Jake understood something he'd been learning for 8 years. Love doesn't always need words. Sometimes it just needs presence. Sometimes it just needs time. Sometimes it just needs a horse who remembers your name. The lesson of Jake Morrison and Belle isn't complicated. Healing happens in relationship, not in isolation, not in silence, not in the safety of avoiding all the things that hurt us, but in the sacred space between two beings who recognize each other's wounds and choose to stay present anyway. Belle didn't cure Jake's trauma. She witnessed it. She didn't take away his pain. She carried it with him. And in that carrying, something shifted. Something that had been broken for 8 years remembered how to trust again. The men who come to Riverside Ranch now understand this instinctively. They're not looking for a cure. They're looking for company, for the presence of another living thing that won't turn away from their darkness, for the radical acceptance that says, your wounds are part of your story, but they're not the end of your story, for the patient love that waits as long as it takes, for the voice that calls their name across the years and says, "Come home," every week. Jake Morrison gets letters from veterans across the country, men and women who heard his story and recognized something of themselves in his silence. Some ask about visiting Riverside Ranch. Others want to start similar programs in their own communities. All of them are looking for the same thing Jake found in Belle's stall 8 years ago: hope. The radical, ridiculous hope that says healing is possible even when it seems impossible. That connection can be rebuilt even after it's been shattered. That love is patient enough to wait 8 years for a single word. If Jake's story means something to you, if you know a veteran who's been carrying weight alone, if you believe that healing happens in relationship, pass it on. Share the story of the man who found his voice in a horse's patient presence. Share the truth that no one is too broken to heal. Share the hope that says, "Come home." The wounded are waiting for someone to show them the way. Sometimes that someone is you. Sometimes that someone is a horse who remembers love. Sometimes that someone is just the willingness to stay present while healing happens. One word at a time, one breath at a time, one day at a time. Thanks for spending time with us today. If this story meant something to you, pass it on. This is Still Standing Souls. Real stories, quiet strength, lasting hope.